Good evening, everyone. And I see a lot of people who were here yesterday and some new faces as well. So thank you for coming. Yesterday, I was talking about how, especially these days, there are certain spiritual practices that are very glamorous. And even after, when we were having dinner at Prasad yesterday afterwards, some people were asking about what makes some of these practices glamorous. Anyway, so today I want to talk about one of these glamorous practices. Mindfulness. Remember yesterday I mentioned that one of these glamorous practices is mindfulness. Because it's glamorous, it doesn't mean that it's not effective. It's also very effective. Mindfulness. How many of you have been to a mindfulness retreat of some sort in the past? Yeah, some of you, right. They're very popular. I've never been to one myself, but people who have said that they're very good. So mindfulness is a really popular spiritual practice, and it would take a different lecture to discuss why it's so popular. But we can start by just talking a little bit historically. First of all, which religion is most associated with mindfulness? Sorry? Exactly, Buddhism, yeah. It's an easy question. So today, what I want to argue is that there are other forms of mindfulness as well that have been neglected. Buddhism, of course, teaches mindfulness. It's one of the main practices. They've turned mindfulness into a science, Buddhist thinkers, Buddhist practitioners, which is a wonderful thing. But they're not alone in teaching the practice of mindfulness. And I want to focus on the Vedantic practice of mindfulness. And you might say, well, what is the Vedantic practice of mindfulness? Where does it come from? What texts are you talking about? So we'll get to all that. But before I do, I want to talk briefly about Buddhist mindfulness. In 1975, a very popular book was published by a Buddhist monk named Thich Nhat Hanh. Almost all of you, I'm sure, are familiar with him. The Miracle of Mindfulness. It's a wonderful book. Part of what makes it so nice is that it's accessible to everybody. And he explains in great detail how to practice mindfulness in your day-to-day lives. You don't need to be a monk to practice these things. So part of what makes mindfulness so effective is that it doesn't ask you necessarily to, especially the Buddhist model, it doesn't ask you to believe many things on faith. God doesn't play any role in Buddhist mindfulness. You don't even have to believe in any kind of higher self. They just ask you to be mindful of what arises in your mind, what kind of feelings arise, what's happening at the level of body. There are different kinds of mindfulness practice, but mindfulness in general in the Buddhist tradition means non-judgmental awareness of what's going on at the level of body and mind. And I really like that formulation. That comes from, I got it at least from a Buddhist text called Satipatthana, The Direct Path to Realization by a Buddhist monk named Bhikkhu Analayo, Analayo. I strongly recommend the book, actually. It's a wonderful book. He did his PhD in philosophy, I think in Germany. And he's written a number of scholarly works. This is one of them. In that book, he explains Buddhist mindfulness in great detail. And the foundational text for Buddhist mindfulness is what's called the Satipatthana Sutta, found in the Tipitaka, the three baskets, which are the key scriptures in the Buddhist tradition. They're supposed to contain Buddha's own teachings. And the Satipatthana Sutta is supposed to contain his teachings on the practice of sati. Sati in Pali comes from the Sanskrit word. Does anyone know the Sanskrit word that sati comes from? No, good guess, not Shakti, close. And try again. No, one more guess. Smriti. Smriti. So smriti means literally memory or remembrance, recollection. And the Buddhist sati comes from smriti, but they give it a different meaning. So in the hands of the Buddhists, it means mindfulness rather than remembering something. Now, one of the first articles I wrote long back on Indian philosophy was an article on Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. And the article is called Yogic Mindfulness. So I explain how in a particular sutra of Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, 1.19, the word smriti is used in Sanskrit. And I discuss how some philosophers within the tradition of yoga have interpreted smriti along the lines of Buddhist mindfulness. But that there are some interesting differences also between Buddhist mindfulness and what I call yogic mindfulness. And so I think one can do a similar study, a deep study on Vedantic mindfulness. You can show that there are deep similarities between Vedantic mindfulness and Buddhist mindfulness, and that there are salient differences which give a kind of uniqueness and a special effectiveness to Vedantic mindfulness for people who lean toward Vedanta. So this is not going to be a kind of ranking and saying that Vedantic mindfulness is better than Buddhist mindfulness. It's, as I always maintain in all my lectures, especially including yesterday, for instance, it's really a matter of temperament, what floats your boat. But I want to just map out different forms of mindfulness, especially focusing on Vedantic mindfulness today. So Vedantic mindfulness, what is it? It's based on the fundamental idea that we are not the body-mind complex, but that we are eternal divine souls. Already people who have some philosophical background might say, well, which tradition of Vedanta are you thinking of? And we sort of talked about this briefly yesterday as well in the Q&A, but I'll mention just the relevant point here. It's not the case that only Advaita Vedanta teaches that we are an eternal divine soul separate from the body-mind complex. In fact, every single school of Vedanta teaches it. All the Bhakti schools of Vedanta, every non-Advaitic school of Vedanta also teaches that we are not the body-mind complex and that we are actually an eternal divine soul separate from the psychophysical complex. One of the key differences between Shankara school of Advaita Vedanta and the non-Advaitic schools of Vedanta is when it comes to explaining what is the precise nature of this soul, the soul that is in you, the soul that is in you, the soul that is in me. Advaita ultimately says there's only one soul. The soul is non-dual, and that's the ultimate reality and nothing else exists. This is Advaita Vedanta. Other schools of Vedanta hold that you have one individual soul, you have another individual, every single person sitting here as an individual has a separate individual soul, as do I. But they don't disagree. None of these schools of Vedanta actually disagree on the question of whether we have eternal divine souls separate from the body-mind. So I say all this just to emphasize that this practice of Vedantic mindfulness applies across the board to all of the schools of Vedanta. I'm not teaching a specifically Advaitic practice. This is a Vedantic practice of mindfulness that applies as much to Shankara's Advaita Vedanta, as to Ramanuja's Vishtadvaita, as to Madhva's Vedanta, Chaitanya's Achinta Bheda Vedanta, and so on and so forth. If you have questions, follow-up questions, you can ask in the Q&A. Feel free. One thing I'll mention, I mentioned it briefly yesterday, but in Ramanuja's school, he has a practice called Jnana Yoga. Jnana Yoga, as you know, is a path of knowledge. In Advaita Vedanta, Jnana Yoga means meditating on, contemplating your true nature as non-dual Brahman, as you know. Ramanuja says Jnana Yoga is the practice of meditating on your eternal individual soul, separate from the body-mind complex. So the only major difference between Ramanuja's path of knowledge and Shankara's path of knowledge is that for Ramanuja, we each have a different individual soul. And for Shankara, everybody has the same non-dual self, ultimately. But the practice is very similar because it involves viveka, discrimination between what? Between the psychophysical complex, the body-mind complex on the one hand, and the eternal divine soul on the other. And so Ramanuja's form of Vedantic mindfulness is what he calls Jnana Yoga. Okay, so now let's dive a little bit more deeply into what Vedantic mindfulness practice looks like. The key is this: since we're not actually the body-mind complex, whatever happens at the level of the body, whatever horrible sufferings we undergo, whatever pleasures that the body is undergoing, they don't ultimately affect our true nature, which is as a soul, as eternal divine souls. Whatever happens at the level of mind, whatever thoughts arise in the mind, whatever troubling thoughts, thoughts of depression, terrible thoughts, any kind of thoughts. What Vedantic mindfulness practice helps us to do is take a step back from those thoughts, from what's happening to us at the level of body, whatever pains we might be undergoing, whatever happens to us at the level of feeling, pleasant or unpleasant feelings or anything in between, whatever thoughts arise in the mind. It teaches us how to take a step back from what's happening at the level of the body-mind complex. So it's a very powerful practice. And in Vedanta, the key is, now we have to go back to a little bit of Vedantic metaphysics, again, shared by all of the schools of Vedanta. Every single thing in this world is made up of the three gunas: sattva, rajas, and tamas. Right? And everything in this world is insentient. Everything in the natural world is insentient. The body is insentient, and it's made up of the three gunas. And a little bit more startlingly, especially to the Western sensibility, the mind is also completely insentient. It is just as insentient as the physical body. It's a subtle form of matter. The mind is a subtle form of matter. As Swami Vivekananda puts it, that is the first proposition the Hindu boy learns, that the mind is matter, only finer. It's a sukshma, a subtle form of matter, whereas this physical body is a gross form of matter. But they're both insentient matter, okay? So, sattva, I gave a talk, I think it was in Houston, on the three gunas, and that would be a separate discussion, but I want to very briefly discuss. What are these three gunas? Sattva guna, matter, these are all energies. Gunas means, I like the translation energies. The energy of sattva manifests in the form of tranquility, calmness, devotion, many spiritual qualities, dispassion towards the world, toward worldly attachments, those kinds of things. Rajas, the energy of rajas, leads to restlessness, ambition, desire to sort of always do, I want to do this, I want to do that, I want to do this. Being full of desires and passions, lust, anger, greed. Tamas, the energy of tamas, which literally means darkness, manifests as delusion, as confusion, as laziness, sleepiness, drowsiness, and many other things. Okay, so it's important to just keep these things in mind as we move forward. So now, remember I was anticipating one of your questions. You're talking about Vedantic mindfulness. Where do you get this idea from? I think it's contained very explicitly in Bhagavad Gita, especially chapter 14. Chapter 14, if any of you have studied the Bhagavad Gita, concerns the three gunas. And in verse 19 of chapter 14, Bhagavan Krishna explains this technique of Vedantic mindfulness. So I'm going to read the Sanskrit shloka and then explain it in English. Nanyam gunebhyaha kartaram yada drashtanupashyati gunebhyascha param veti madbhavam sodigachyati. When the seer, the drashta, the witness with capital W, perceives that the gunas are doing everything and knows that which is supreme, param, beyond the gunas, gunebhyascha param veti, that person attains my divine nature, says Bhagavan Krishna. That person who can take a step back from the body-mind complex and say that everything at the level of body is just the play of the gunas, everything at the level of mind is also the same play of the gunas. And I am neither the body nor the mind. That person attains the divine nature because that person is able to identify with his or her true spiritual essence as a divine soul, which is one with God. And then a little bit later in the same chapter, chapter 14 of the Gita, Krishna goes on to explain in even more detail what Vedantic mindfulness looks like. So I'm going to read these two verses, 22 and 23. Prakasham cha pravrittim cha moham eva cha pandava na dveshti sampravrittani na nivrittani kamshati udasina vadasino gunaidyo vichalyate guna vattantityeva yovatishtati negate. The person who has transcended the three gunas, the gunatita, is the person who is not affected by anything that arises in the mind. What might arise in the mind? Remember, so actually, in the previous verses in chapter 14 of the Gita, there's a kind of laundry list of how sattva guna manifests in different ways in our life, how rajas manifests, how tamas manifests. And then Arjuna asks the question, what are the characteristics of somebody who has transcended all of these gunas? And then Bhagavan Krishna gives these verses in response. And in the first verse that I just read to you, in a single word, in a single key word, he captures the essence of sattva, rajas, and tamas. So all those different things I said, all the wonderful qualities that come from sattva, tranquility, calmness, he encapsulates all of that in one word in Sanskrit, prakasham, the first word in that shloka. Prakasham, which means literally illumination. There's a kind of lightness and a kind of illumination. There's also a buoyancy and joy in life when sattva predominates in you. So when the mind is full of sattva, that's what prakasham means. Second word used by Bhagavan Krishna, pravrittim. This is the word encapsulating the essence of rajas. Pravritti means somebody who's rushing headlong into action. I want to do this, I have to do that. Full of passion and energy. Sometimes the mind is very rajasic and you just can't sit still. When you sit still, suddenly one part of your body starts shaking, or you start talking randomly. So that means because you're full of rajas. The third key word, which encapsulates the essence of tamas, is moham, which means delusion. But it captures all of the different manifestations of tamas as well. Okay, so prakasham cha pravrittim cha moham eva cha pandava. When any of the sattvic qualities are present at the level of mind, whether good or bad, doesn't matter. The person who has transcended the gunas, not dveshti sampravrittani. Sampravrittani means when these things are there, present in the mind. That person is not disturbed. Normally you would think, ordinary people will think that, well, having delusion in the mind is a terrible thing. Being so restless that you can't sit still, that's a very bad thing. The beauty of this Vedantic mindfulness practice is that, remember, non-judgmental awareness. You're not feeling bad about yourself because, oh my goodness, why is my mind full of delusion? Why am I such a busybody? You just note the fact that they're in your mind and take a step back from whatever is happening at the level of mind. And it's incredibly freeing. When you stop judging yourself and judging what's happening at the level of mind and at the level of body, you feel a certain kind of liberation. This is not the highest liberation, but a liberation from sort of guilt complexes, repressions, and all sorts of things that develop because you feel guilty about what's in your mind, or you're not able to control what's in your mind. Take a step back from what's happening in your mind, and you'll feel a lightness and a kind of freedom. And then in the next few verses, so I just read to you verses 22 and 23. Oh, and let me give you the translation of the 23. The person who has transcended the gunas is completely unshaken by the gunas, not affected by them at all. That person stands far beyond the gunas and sees that whatever is happening at the level of the body and at the level of the mind is nothing but the workings of the three gunas. And this person just takes a step back. He's just the tranquil witness, completely unaffected. In fact, Swami Vedananda, he says something very similar. He would often recommend this practice. He says, I am the infinite blue sky. Over me pass these clouds of various colors, remain a moment, and vanish. I am the same eternal blue. I'm the witness, the same eternal witness of all. So the clouds represent anything that's happening at the level of the body-mind complex. Whether sattvic or rajasic or tamasic, it doesn't matter. They're equal from that standpoint because you're inhabiting such a high altitude. From that standpoint, there's not even a distinction between the three gunas because you're beyond all of them. So this is a very effective practice recommended frequently by Swami Vedananda. So in the subsequent verses in chapter 14, Bhagavan Krishna goes on to explain some of the other characteristics of the person who has transcended the three gunas. Some of them are, the Sanskrit terms are samadukha sukha, which means you're completely equal, you're the same in the midst of happiness and sadness. You can say, well, you might ask, well, how is that even, what does that mean? How can somebody be the same in happiness and sadness? Because happiness and sadness are both at the level of mind. And if you're identifying with the soul beyond the mind, then it doesn't matter whether the mind is happy or unhappy, depressed or miserable, because you are the soul, which is infinitely blissful, right? Other attributes, tulya priya priyo. That means you're equal in the midst of very pleasant circumstances and in the midst of extremely unpleasant circumstances. Again, because all of these things are only relevant, they only affect the body and mind, but not the deeper soul within. So now you might be saying, well, these are characteristics of the illumined soul who has transcended the three gunas. But where does that leave us? These poor souls. We're ordinary spiritual aspirants, and we're very far from transcending the gunas, right? So here, Bhagavan Shankaracharya has made a wonderful statement. One of my favorite statements from his commentaries. He says this actually in a slightly different context, but it applies equally here. Chapter 2 of Bhagavad Gita. Arjuna asks, how does the illumined person walk? How does that person talk? How does that person behave? How does that person sit? And he gives this kind of list in his question. And then Krishna gives a long list of qualities of this illumined being, and none of which directly answer Arjuna's question. That's a kind of separate issue. But Arjuna is looking for external signs, and Krishna says there are no external signs, there are only internal signs. The person who has completely eliminated worldly desires from his or her heart, that person is truly illumined. The person who has absolutely no craving for any worldly attachments or pleasures, that person is illumined. So they're all internal characteristics. In that context, Shankaracharya says the following. He says, Sarvatrevahi Adhyatma Shastre. So in all the scriptures relating to spirituality, whether you were talking about the Upanishads or Bhagavad Gita, Bhagavata Purana, or any of these wonderful scriptures, Kritartha Lakshanani Yani, those characteristics which describe the realized soul, like we find in chapter 2 of the Gita, like we find also in chapter 14 of the Gita, the characteristics of the person who has transcended the three gunas. Shankaracharya says, Tani eva sadhanani upadishyante yatna sadhyatva. Those very characteristics are meant to be practiced, cultivated by ordinary spiritual aspirants through self-effort. So the idea is, the reason why these scriptures like the Bhagavad Gita go into great detail, enumerating the different characteristics of illumined souls who have transcended the gunas, is to give us a kind of roadmap for how we should try to behave in our daily lives. Let's try to emulate illumined beings, and we ourselves will eventually attain illumination. That's the idea. So we should never think that these scriptural teachings are too high. We're not realizing, so it's not relevant to us. No, we should try to cultivate the same qualities in us so that we ourselves can become illumined. And each one of us will eventually become illumined. That's also a great hope. In our tradition, the Ramakrishna Vivekananda tradition, every single person sitting in this room, every person in this world, every soul will eventually attain illumination. If not in this life, then in a subsequent life, because there are many lives, right? Okay, so now I've given a kind of overview of the Vedantic practice of mindfulness. And for the remainder of the talk, what I wanted to do is raise one question, which is, now I've explained in detail what is Vedantic mindfulness. I haven't talked much about Buddhist mindfulness, but many of you are probably familiar with some of the key elements in Buddhist mindfulness. You might ask, what are some of the differences between the Buddhist practice of mindfulness and the Vedantic practice of mindfulness? And I want to point out especially two important differences. And again, the point here is not to say that one is better than the other, but first let's gain some clarity about what are the similarities between these practices and what are the differences. And then we can practice what we like. We can even incorporate aspects of both. So the first difference is concerning this question of whether there's a higher self. Because remember, the whole practice of Vedantic mindfulness is based on the doctrine that we are not the body-mind complex, but a deeper eternal soul, Atman, right? What do Buddhists say about this? Anatta is the Pali term, which occurs very frequently in the Tipitaka. That's the Buddha's teaching, no self. Now, if you go into the kind of deeper scholarly literature on this issue, it gets very complicated very quickly. And there are different interpretations of this no self doctrine in Buddhism. Some scholars actually claim that all that the Buddha is denying is the empirical self, the body-mind kind of self, but that he's not necessarily denying the Upanishadic Atman. But there are other scholars who say that no, Buddha is also denying any kind of higher self, including the Upanishadic Atman, Brahman. So it's very complicated. But in any case, I guarantee you, those who have attended these mindfulness retreats, if they're Buddhist ones, these Buddhist teachers are not usually talking about higher self, identifying with the higher self, a witness, not like, I mean, that would be very surprising. So I think that's an important difference in general, is that when Buddhist practitioners teach mindfulness and when they practice mindfulness, they're not identifying with their true nature as a deeper soul. Whereas that's a key element in Vedantic mindfulness. Okay. And then you might ask, well, why should we prefer Vedantic mindfulness? As I said, it's a matter of temperament. But certain spiritual aspirants, temperamentally, and based on their Purva Janma Samskaras, what they've done in their previous lives, whatever practices they've done in their previous lives, they just have a kind of intuition or conviction that they're a deeper soul, separate from the body-mind complex. For those people, Vedantic mindfulness will probably be more effective than Buddhist mindfulness, because it gives us a kind of what I might call a metaphysical anchor for our mindfulness practice. See, when we take a step back from our thoughts, when we take a step back from our feelings or the pains that are occurring at the level of the body, we're identifying with something that's fundamentally real, that's true, which is that we're actually eternal divine souls separate from the body-mind. And so that's a real advantage in mindfulness practice, actually, in the Vedantic practice of mindfulness, because we have a kind of metaphysical foundation for recognizing our true nature separate from the body-mind complex. And Swamiji, he also recommends this practice in the text Raja Yoga. I think Mataji teaches Raja Yoga on Thursdays. I think you probably already covered this part of it, because I think it happens fairly early on in the text. I'll just repeat to you this part of it. Swamiji says, the first lesson then is to sit for some time and let the mind run on. The mind is bubbling up all the time. It is like that monkey jumping about. Let the monkey jump as much as he can. You simply wait and watch. Don't bother about what's happening at the level of mind. So then he continues. Knowledge is power, says the proverb, and that is true. Until you know what the mind is doing, you cannot control it. Give it the rein. Many hideous thoughts may come into it. You will be astonished that it was possible for you to think such thoughts. But you will find that each day the mind's vagaries are becoming less and less violent, that each day it is becoming calmer. This is Vedantic mindfulness, actually. You can equally call it yogic mindfulness. As I said, I wrote an article on yogic mindfulness, and this is in the context of Patanjali's Yoga Sutra. But the point is, at that level, we're talking about a very similar practice, because both in the Yoga Sutras and in Vedanta, there's a belief that you're an eternal individual soul, separate from the body-mind. Now, if there's a God or not, that gets complicated in yoga versus Vedanta. So many of us have a kind of daily meditation practice. We sit in the morning, we sit in the evening. So it's very useful to follow what Swamiji is saying. It need not be our main practice. But before we do our main practice, whether that's japa or prayer or whatever else, we can do what Swamiji advises, which is just let the mind run on and just take a step back from the mind and just have fun and see what comes up in the mind without getting affected by it, either happy or sad. It's a very effective practice. Okay, so that to me is the first important difference between Vedantic mindfulness and Buddhist mindfulness. Vedantic mindfulness has a kind of metaphysical anchor or foundation in an eternal divine soul. Second key difference is that Buddhist mindfulness makes no appeal to any kind of God, at least in general. Maybe that might be an overgeneralization. There might be some East Asian forms of Buddhist mindfulness where they do emphasize God. I haven't encountered them, but if you're aware of that, you can let me know. But Vedantic mindfulness is perfectly compatible with bhakti, with devotion for the personal God. So it's not mutually exclusive with devotional practices. And in fact, devotional practices can supplement and actually strengthen. They can enhance mindfulness practice. They can go hand in hand. Just to give you a sense of how. In that same chapter 14 of Bhagavad Gita, Shloka 26, toward the very end of the chapter, Bhagavan Krishna says, Mam cha yogi vicharena bhakti yogena sevate sagunan samatityetan brahma bhuyaya kalpate. In the entire chapter 14, there's no mention of bhakti, no mention of God, nothing. And then suddenly in one verse toward the very end, after describing all the wonderful characteristics of an illumined being who has transcended the three gunas through tremendous self-effort and all this, Bhagavan Krishna says, you can get all of that. You can become a trigunatita. You can transcend the three gunas just by practicing bhakti yoga, by worshiping me with devotion and faith. So what does that mean? It means that there's absolutely no conflict or contradiction between devotional practices like prayer, surrender, japa on the one hand, and mindfulness practice on the other. We can combine them. And this is a unique feature of the Ramakrishna Vivekananda tradition also, because in traditional Vedanta, usually these practices are not meant to be practiced together. So according to Shankara school of Advaita Vedanta, the practice of bhakti, devotion, is meant for inferior spiritual aspirants who have not yet attained purity of mind. And the path of knowledge, jnana yoga, is meant to be practiced by superior spiritual aspirants who have already attained purity of mind. So the same person cannot be practicing bhakti yoga and jnana yoga. Impossible. It's called in traditional Sanskrit terminology, jnana karma samuchaya. Doing both at the same time. Shankara says that's a no-no. It's like being in third grade and doing your PhD at the same time. You can't do it. Either you're in third grade or you're doing your PhD. First you go through high school, then you do your undergraduate, then you get the PhD after you get your master's, right? Same way, practice bhakti so long as you're an inferior aspirant. Once you become a superior aspirant, you practice jnana yoga and you no longer practice bhakti. This is at least the traditional Advaitic understanding of spiritual practices. But in our tradition, no problem with combining jnana yoga with bhakti yoga. So this is also a very powerful resource, actually, which is usually absent in the Buddhist forms of mindfulness, which is that instead of relying completely on our own self-effort, like the baby monkey in Sri Ramakrishna's teachings, I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. Sri Ramakrishna says there are two basic paradigms. One is the baby monkey holding on for dear life to the mother monkey, as the mother monkey jumps from branch to branch, from tree to tree. And if the baby lets go of its hold, even for a moment, what happens? It gets dashed to the ground and killed. Brain turns to mush. There's another paradigm, he says. The paradigm of the baby kitten. All it says is mew, mew. It just sits still, doesn't even move. Mew, mew. And the mother cat, when it feels like it, will take up the baby kitten and put it in another place, wherever it feels like. And the baby kitten is completely unbothered because it's completely surrendered to mother. And Sri Ramakrishna says the baby monkey represents the person who has the attitude of somebody who says, self-effort, self-effort, self-effort. I'm doing everything. I have to do this. I have to do that. I'm going to do it through my own willpower. I'm doing it on my own. This is a very Buddhist kind of idea. And it's also found in some traditions of Vedanta also, especially Advaita Vedanta. But in Ramakrishna Vivekananda Vedanta, he says, try to be more like the baby kitten, because you'll find that a great relief and a great resource, because you are not alone in your spiritual practices. And no matter how much effort we exert, no matter how hard we try, it's only by God's grace that we can really make any substantial spiritual progress. So why not rely on God from the beginning? This is the idea. So try to be more like the baby kitten. So even when you're trying to practice mindfulness and you're sitting down for meditation, some unpleasant thought comes up in your mind, you try to take a step back and you fail. Obviously we'll fail. It's the nature of human life, and we're going to fail. We fail on a daily basis when we engage in spiritual practice. Until we attain illumination, we'll be failing. Every time you fail, you're not able to quite take that step back, call on God, pray to God, and say, oh Lord, without you, I can't do this properly. By your grace alone can I engage in this mindfulness practice properly. So you see, that's just a simple example, but you can beautifully combine devotional practices like prayer and japa along with mindfulness. And in fact, that's also encouraged in Christian devotional traditions. Have any of you read a book called Philokalia Have you heard of the book? She has, Mataji, Brahma Prana Mataji. So it's a wonderful book. These are recordings of the teachings of what are called the Desert Fathers, which were these great Christian monks, ascetics basically, who lived in the desert just centuries after Christ was crucified. And their main practice was basically japa. They called it hesychasm, Hesychasm. They would repeat prayer, and one particular prayer, oh, Lord Jesus, have mercy on me, something like that. But what these Desert Fathers recommend is, as you're repeating that prayer in the form of this kind of mental repetition of this mantra, you should combine it with what's called nepsis in Greek. Nepsis means watchfulness, which is just another word for mindfulness, actually. Combine hesychasm with nepsis. As you're engaging with prayer, as you're engaging in prayer, you at the same time practice nepsis, which means watch out for what's happening at the level of mind. And when your mind gets deviated from God, when you get distracted from the mantra. So the two things can be happening simultaneously. In the gospel, Sri Ramakrishna will often, when people ask, what did I do? He'll often practices, one of which falls under bhakti, the other falls under jnana, or even mindfulness. Prarthana, prayer, a devotional practice. And he says, shoda shod vichara, sat asat vichara. Distinguish between what's permanent and what's transitory. Mindfulness falls under that category, actually. Sat asat vichara. It's a form of sat asat vichara. Because our physical bodies are asat. Our minds, asat. The only sat is the eternal divine soul within. But prayer is also perfectly compatible with that practice. So and he encourages the practice of both at the same time. Sri Ramakrishna. So I think we can end on that note. One thing I'll just recommend is, I'll repeat it a third time. I'm not saying that Vedantic mindfulness is better than Buddhist mindfulness. And in fact, because as I said, Buddhists have turned mindfulness practice into a science. I mean, it's really incredible what they've done. I mean, detailing every stage, every possible obstacle, how to overcome those obstacles. We as Vedantins can learn a tremendous amount from the Buddhist literature on mindfulness. So I recommend, for instance, that you look at that the book that I recommended by this Bhikkhu Analayo called Satipatthana, the Direct Path to Realization. And another nice thing about this book is that he actually cites very recent scientific studies on mindfulness and its benefits. And one of them is very striking. I think it's inspiring, actually. There's a study done in an alcoholic, in a rehab clinic for alcoholics. And these are people who have been alcoholics for many years. And they're recently put in this rehab clinic and they're sober. And obviously it's a very difficult time for them. And some doctors come to these patients who are just newly sober. And they tell these patients who are struggling with this alcohol addiction the following. They say, you only need to practice one thing. It's a very simple practice, and we don't ask you to do anything else besides that. It's the practice of mental labeling. Mental labeling. And the practice is, whenever a thought of drinking arises in your mind, that desire to drink arises in your mind, just mentally label that thought. That's it. You literally just label it and say, a desire to drink has arisen in my mind. And then these patients are totally skeptical. Like, how will that possibly cure me of my alcoholism? That's crazy. But in many cases, it did the trick. I'm not saying in all cases, that's great. That would be far too optimistic. But it worked in the case of many patients. Because what does this act of mental labeling do? It automatically gives you a little breathing space from those thoughts. It breaks the identification with that desire to drink that arises in the mind. So that's just one example, but the book is full of these kinds of really insightful observations, discussions of scientific studies, and I strongly recommend it. We can easily incorporate many aspects of Buddhist mindfulness into Vedantic mindfulness as well. Thank you. So now I'd like to hear from you. Questions? Oh, okay. Mm-hmm.
fire with heat, which is Saguda, and Brahman, which is heat, in other words, fire without heat, which is Nirguna, both exist ultimately. Please clarify.
Okay, I mean, this is more pertaining to what we were talking about yesterday. Is it okay to answer that now, or what do you think? Why don't we table it? I mean, let's first focus, otherwise we might just go in a completely different direction. If there are questions online that directly relate to this talk, that might be more helpful. Or yeah, people in the room first, and then we can, okay, so why don't we go left to right or something? So who's the leftmost? Yeah, go ahead. Name first. Yeah, hi. Namaste. Yeah. Yeah.
Differentiate between what Dasina is in this context versus being a Sakshi or.
Okay, I mean, Sakshi is not a word that's actually used in the verses I quoted. That's,
But there's also a word.
oh, certainly. Yeah, that's true. Sakshi is a word that's used. I don't think that there is any major difference actually. So udasina means indifferent. So the idea is not to be affected at all by what arises, what happens at the level of body mind. That's the idea. And that's exactly the point of trying to identify with the Sakshi, the witness, right? Because the witness is unaffected by what's happening. Yeah? Okay, sure. Yes, sitting in the back.
I've been given the reference to the actual steps and which we can follow. At the Vedantic.
Yeah, I can do that. I mean, actually, there are detailed, there are many different kinds of mindfulness practice, actually. And so in Satipatthana Sutta, for instance, the Buddha's mindfulness, we can do exactly the same thing that the Buddha recommends, and then just add the metaphysical kind of foundation to it, which is that, so let me explain it this way. Buddha says, focus on the breath first. This is often the best place to start because it's so kind of tangible. It's something we do all the time, right? And so you close your eyes, you focus on your breath, you're mindful of your breath as you inhale, and you're mindful of your breath as you exhale. This is breath mindfulness. Okay? Again, Vedantic mindfulness practitioners can do exactly the same thing as what the Buddha has recommended, except you just add, I am an eternal divine soul witnessing the breath at the level of the pranamaya atma, you can say, at the level of the vital being. Inhale, exhale. I was actually thinking about doing a 5-minute practice, but I didn't know whether that would be hokey or not. So, is that fine? We can do it if you want. Okay. Well, all right. So please close your eyes. Breathe normally, and as you inhale, just be mindful of the inhalation. And as you exhale, be mindful of the exhalation. Breathe in, breathe out, be mindful of the breath. If you have trouble focusing on the breath, focus on the tip of the nose, where the breath goes in and out of the nostrils. Anytime your mind deviates from the breath, just note it and gently bring the mind back to the breath. Whatever painful or stressful thoughts or feelings you've had during the course of the week, during the exhalation, imagine that you're exhaling out all those stressful thoughts, those painful feelings, memories. And just continue to be mindful of the breath as you inhale and as you exhale. Now be mindful of the pranamaya atma, the vital layer of our being. This is the stuff of feeling. What feelings arise in you? Whatever feelings arise, pleasant, unpleasant, or otherwise, just be mindful. Just take a step back from the feelings, whatever they are, and let them go. And don't identify with them. All these feelings occur at the level of the body-mind. In your deepest essence, you're completely untouched by these feelings because you're the eternal divine soul. So try to identify with that deeper soul within. And just be mindful of anything that occurs at the level of body, at the level of feeling. Now be mindful of what's happening at the level of mind. Be mindful of what thoughts arise in the mind. Don't fight with them, don't obsess about them, but just recognize what they are and take a step back from them, whatever they are, pleasant, unpleasant, good or bad. I am the eternal divine soul, the witness, separate from the body, separate from the mind. I'm completely unaffected by what happens in the mind. If some of you have been initiated into a mantra, you can also actually mentally repeat a mantra, calling on God for help as you practice this mindfulness. Anytime you fall back and identify with any of the thoughts at the level of the mind, just take a step back again. Just be mindful. Take a step back from your thoughts. Identify with the deeper soul within and call on God. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Now you can gently open your eyes. So that's just a small preview of, there are at least 3 different kinds of mindfulness that we went through briefly. One is breath mindfulness. The other is mindfulness of feelings. The third is mindfulness of thoughts, right? And all of them are different forms of mindfulness. You can combine them. If you like one more than the other, you can just do that one. In fact, Buddha says that just through mindfulness of breath, you can attain everything. You can attain the highest nirvana. Through any of these kinds of mindfulness, actually. And so it's not that you have to go through them sequentially. That's another form. You can actually go through them sequentially or focus on one, whatever's disturbing you the most. Maybe it's really some troubling thoughts or something. So then focus on mindfulness of thoughts. If you're going through some terrible depression or something, then mindfulness of feelings might be better for you. Or some combination of mindfulness of feeling, mindfulness of thoughts. Or if you're undergoing some terrible physical suffering, whether it's cancer or something else, mindfulness of body might be more. Okay, so that's a small example. So we're going kind of from left to right. And so who is next after the person? Yeah, anybody else on this side? No? Okay, so then on the right side? Yeah, Cheryl, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
not affected by anything going on in the world.
Yeah.
And other times he's very hateful.
Yeah. Hmm. Hmm.
Mind into the role of feeling, and other times he's able to back.
Yeah, I think the way, I mean, if we want to bring in the Taittiriya Upanishad scheme of 5 levels of being, that might help. Oh, Sri Ramakrishna seemed to effortlessly be able to transcend feeling at certain times when he went into states of samadhi or ecstasy. And at other times would be laughing, giggling, telling jokes with young men, the people, his visitors. And he seemed to do it so effortlessly. And so that's the question. I mean, how is that possible? And so to answer the question, I think it might be helpful to bring in the 5-fold scheme of being, which you find in the Taittiriya Upanishad. So there are 5 levels. There's Annamaya, Pranamaya, Manomaya, Vijnanamaya, and Anandamaya. Annamaya is and one thing I should emphasize, all these 5 levels of being, often we call them koshas, but that word is never used in the Taittiriya Upanishad. And that's a kind of, Advaita Vedantas use it, but if you go back to the original words, you'll find 2 words used, Atma and Purusha, which is very significant. And Sri Aurobindo strongly emphasizes that, because they're all real. They're different real levels of being that we can access. Some are deeper than the others. So the most superficial is the outer physical, that's the Annamaya. And then as you go deeper and deeper, you get Pranamaya, Manomaya, Vijnanamaya, and then Anandamaya, right? But that doesn't make the superficial levels unreal. They're not just unreal coverings. Okay, so they're all Atmas. And as a Vijnani, Sri Ramakrishna would revel in, sort of at will, he was able to kind of inhabit these different levels of being, basically. He used to say that the Vijnani is able to go from the Nitya to the Lila and back from the Lila to the Nitya. Nitya is Nirguna Brahman, non-dual Brahman. Lila is everything else. And so you can consider all 5 of the levels of being, in a sense, are all in the level of Lila, God's Lila. And then what's beyond the 5 levels of Atma is non-dual Brahman. And so he can just pass through any of these levels of being, these different levels of consciousness at will. So I think I hope that's a short answer to your question. And it's linked to mindfulness practice, because you can be mindful of any one of these levels of being. You can be mindful at the level of Annamaya, so the physical level, the physical body. Pranamaya, as I said, is the level of feeling. Be mindful of your feelings, whatever feelings arise. You can be mindful at the level of the mind, Manomaya, what thoughts arise in your mind. Vijnanamaya is complicated because it's interpreted in many different ways in different traditions. Sri Aurobindo, he's very interesting because he was influenced by Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda. He's one of the only people I've encountered who interprets the Vijnanamaya Atma in terms of Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana. He doesn't actually explicitly refer to Sri Ramakrishna, but it's exactly the same concept. And he says it's this kind of threshold state where you can go from the Nitya to the Lila and back up from the Lila to the Nitya. So that's quite remarkable. And he does the same thing in his commentary on the Bhagavad Gita. The terms Jnana and Vijnana come up in the Bhagavad Gita many times, chapter 7, chapter 9. And he says that it's best to understand Jnana in the Bhagavad Gita as knowledge of non-dual Brahman, very much like Sri Ramakrishna says, climbing up the staircase until you reach the roof. And he says Vijnana is what he calls the integral or comprehensive knowledge of the divine as not only Nirguna but also Saguna, and pervading this entire universe. Again, very much like what Sri Ramakrishna says about the Vijnani. So that's a discussion for another talk. I have an article on that if you're interested. You can look it up on my website. Another question? Yeah, in the back. Yeah, it's you. The one with the hand up. Yeah. Hi, Luis. Mental labeling. Yeah, in the rehab clinic. Yeah. Well, you can also do mental labeling. I mean, there's no problem with that. But as I said, the only difference is, or one of the key differences is, in Vedantic mindfulness, you should be trying to identify with the deeper soul within. At the same time that you're doing the mental labeling or the mindfulness of feeling or thought. Is that an answer to the question, or are you asking something different? I mean, yeah. So the question is, what particular Vedantic practice of mindfulness do I prefer? It's very much like the one that Swamiji recommends, which is that you identify with the Atman, the eternal soul, deeper within, and you just be mindful of what's happening at the level of, either body or feeling or mind. And again, you don't have to do them sequentially. You can focus on one rather than the other. So I don't see major differences in Buddhist mindfulness practice and Vedantic mindfulness at the level of technique, except that there's this added layer, which is that you're identifying with the soul within in the Vedantic version. Does that make sense? And there's no one-size-fits-all mindfulness practice. I mean, you sort of have to kind of customize it for whatever will most benefit you, depending on where your weakness is, really. I mean, where is your pain body located? This is a term used by Eckhart Tolle. This idea that in spiritual life, we need to ultimately try to disintegrate the pain body, which is built up of many, many different painful experiences, and they're just kind of accumulating. And the moment somebody triggers that pain body, you react. So how do you start dissolving the pain body? But where does the pain primarily reside? Is it at the level of the body, or at the level of feeling, or at the level of mind? There's no one answer to that. That depends on each individual. Yeah, I think you had a hand up.
And my understanding about the last meditation is that it's non-positive. And it's not the problem of the opposite, but the thing is dissolved in that thinking. So in that, it is the idea that the last meditation. How do you think that? I mean, can you expand on that? But the big man, right about.
Where are you getting those terms from? I mean, okay, so you're thinking of Advaita Vedantic meditation, is that right? Yeah, because there are many forms of Vedantic meditation, but you're thinking of, so I mean, I think maybe you're thinking of this, which commentary? Kena Upanishad? I mean, yeah, so there's certain verses where, like, Pratibodha Viditam Matam. So whatever thought comes, you should always try to sort of fold that thought back into the Atman, something like that. Something like that. I mean, unless we have the text in front of us, it's difficult for me to actually explain the technique. But I don't think that that's missing necessarily from the yogic practice, and that's part of what I was arguing in my article on yogic mindfulness. Is that there's a practice in 1.19 called smriti sadhana, where even when you're not, deep in meditation, you can still be mindful of what's happening, and I think you can do that equally as a Vedanta and equally as a yogi. There is a special practice that I think you're talking about. It's not entirely clear to me unless we have the text in front of us, but where, because ultimately your true nature is the Atman, you see all the thoughts that arise as reflections of the Atman, or there are different ways of thinking about it. But yeah, I don't practice that myself, so I don't want to say anything dumb or superficial. Yeah, anyone else? And any online questions pertaining to the talk? Otherwise, I can tackle the big question regarding yesterday's discussion. But okay. Okay, so yeah, there's a question mark, but I don't necessarily see a question. Oh. Oh, I see. Okay, okay. So that would be the Advaita Vedantic form of mindfulness. I mean that. So if you believe in Advaita Vedanta, then you should identify with the non-dual Atman, right? And then the non-dual Atman is the only reality. Even Shakti doesn't exist. There's no question of doing prayer at the same time. But as I've been emphasizing throughout my talk, there are non-Advaitic forms of Vedantic mindfulness where you can accept the reality of Shakti and even call on Shakti through prayer and through devotional practices while also engaging in mindfulness practice. I hope that answers the question. Do we want to go back to then that original question? Maybe if you don't mind repeating it, then I can get to it. Oh, okay.
Fire with heat, which is Sakura. Brahman without Shakti, in other words, fire without heat, which is Nirguna, both exist ultimately.
Mm-hmm.
Please clarify.
Okay. First of all, that's not quite right. It's not fire and heat. Sri Ramakrishna used to say fire and its power to burn. So Brahman and Shakti are inseparable, like fire and its power to burn are inseparable. I think the simplest way to explain it is what Sri Ramakrishna himself says. So I'll just repeat it verbatim. And then if there's a follow-up question, you can ask. But when Sri Ramakrishna says, when I think of God as inactive, Nishkriya, then I call it Brahman. When I think of that same divine reality as creating, preserving, and destroying the universe, then I call it Shakti or Kali. And so this person, the questioner, seems to have trouble or difficulty understanding how both can be ultimately true. But it's like saying, I don't understand how a snake can be stationary and wriggling. How it can, I mean, in a sense, he's right, because that analogy just, the snake cannot be moving and stationary at the same time. Whereas what Sri Ramakrishna is saying is that Brahman and Shakti are simultaneously real and simultaneously true. But for different people, so one person might be meditating on or realizing the Shakti aspect, the dynamic aspect, as Sri Ramakrishna often did. Another person might be realizing the Nirguna aspect, right? And so the way that Swami Vivekananda put it is the many and the one are the same reality seen from different standpoints. There's the beautiful building, and if you look at it from this side, it looks like it looks in one way. If you come to another side from the front of the building, it looks different, but it's the same building, right? So partly it's about, I don't know if subjective is the right word here, because it's real, right? But it depends on what part of the house, what side of the house you're looking at. What perspective are you looking at the divine reality from? So I hope that answers the question. Yeah, please. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Study.
Hmm.
He said, if you want to study, take a purpose, memorize it, and live it for a week. Would you like to elaborate on that practice as a form of mindfulness? How do you practice as you are reflecting on your actions modifies your behavior?
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, should I repeat the question or you might? Okay. Yeah. Right. So Mataji is asking. She said she's referring to something Swami Turiyanji said. Somebody asked him, "How do you read? How do you study the Bhagavad Gita?" And as far as I remember, what he says is, I meditate on one verse of the Gita, and I don't move on to the next verse until I have fully mastered what's taught in that verse. So to me, that's a very high level practice. And for most of us, it means we'll never read the Gita. We'll get stuck at not the first sloka. The first sloka is not even a spiritual instruction, right? The first chapter is about Arjuna's depression and all that. But if we, the moment we get to a spiritual teaching, we get stuck there. So, but if we take it down a couple notches and we understand it more in terms of what Mataji is saying, which is that instead of just like reading it in an intellectual way as a kind of scholar or something, or just trying to memorize it or show off to other people that you've memorized the Gita, but you really try to practice and incorporate the teachings of the Gita in your daily life. What she's suggesting is you can focus on one shloka in a week, one verse, and always keep that verse at the forefront of your mind as you go about your daily life. And use it as a kind of, I don't know, like a touchstone. And so when you're raising your children, when you're interacting with your kids, when you're interacting with your spouse, when you're interacting with your coworkers at work, are you able to practice that, whatever that shloka is teaching? Whether it's about, like Tulya Ninda, Stuti Mauni, that's chapter 12, for instance. Be indifferent to praise and blame. It's a wonderful thing to recite, but much more difficult to practice. So can you practice that when somebody to your face is criticizing you, or maybe you find out that somebody's backbiting against you, find out from somebody else? How do you react? Well, you shouldn't react. That's the ideal Vedantic response. That's also the ideal Buddhist mindful response. And so one version of, I think one creative way of kind of adapting Vedantic mindfulness practice to what you're suggesting, Mataji, is that you can try to be mindful of whatever Gita verse you have for that week. And then try to live up to it in your day-to-day life, whatever you're doing, whatever circumstances you find yourself in. Something like that? Yeah. Behave, basically. Yeah, right.
Behaving in a certain way, so it allows you to mindfully then pull back from that behavior that's not in tune.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. Yeah, and I think it is significant that Krishna kind of gives a non sequitur to Arjuna's question, because he doesn't explain how the person sits or walks. He says it doesn't matter what you're doing. What matters is the inner attitude with which you do whatever you're doing in your daily life. So that's what you need to refine. That's what you need to spiritualize and purify. That attitude, the inner motivation behind what you're doing. And mindfulness is an invaluable asset in kind of helping us to kind of cultivate the right attitude in whatever actions we find ourselves doing in the course of our daily lives. Absolutely, yeah. There's a question in the back, yeah. Yeah, go ahead. Well, you do lose it, and so long as you have not realized the self, in the sense of, once you identify with the self, can you subsequently lose that feeling of identification with the self? And I think the answer is yes, so long as you have not attained full-blown realization of the self. What we're doing, what we did in the 5 minutes, and what you might do at home in your daily spiritual practice is called spiritual practice, with the aim of attaining realization of the Atman. But the two things are not the same, right? So one is, as a spiritual aspirant, you're kind of imaginatively identifying with the deeper soul within, with the aim of ultimately attaining spiritual knowledge, spiritual realization of your true nature as the Atman. But so we shouldn't mix up the spiritual practice with the goal. Does that make sense? Or maybe did I misunderstand the question? Yeah. 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 Can you lose that? Yeah, but you do until you've actually realized the self, because that's not realization. So this mindfulness practice, right? When Swamiji says, "I'm the infinite blue sky, clouds pass over me," that's wonderful for 5 minutes, and then what happens? We identify with the clouds again. We forget that we're the sky, the infinite blue sky. That's the problem. That's the whole point of kind of repeatedly engaging in spiritual practice, reminding ourselves of our true nature, because we keep lapsing back into identifying with the body-mind. So long as we have not attained liberation, we'll always lapse back into that identification with the body-mind, as far as I'm aware. Yeah?
One last question. How can meditation on the personal God, where you focus on the deity, may be made mindful, where we also identify the eternal soul within?
Right. That's a nice question. So how do we reconcile this mindfulness practice? Vedantic mindfulness, remember, a key component of it is identifying with the deeper soul within. And I also mentioned that Vedantic mindfulness practice is perfectly compatible with bhakti. And so this person is asking a very practical and important question, which is, how do you kind of keep both these things in mind at the same time? Well, you can do that because they're both real and they're both real entities. It's true that in your deepest nature, you are an eternal divine soul. And you can think of yourself as there are different metaphors for it. You can think of yourself as a spark of God, a child of God. Amritasya putra is the term used in Shvetashvatara Upanishad. We're children of immortal bliss. And so if you think of yourself as a sort of part of the divine whole, then try to identify with your true spiritual nature in the heart as you commune with God in the heart. And so you are the eternal soul and you're communing with the personal God in whatever form you like to think of God. So that's how I see it. You in your deepest essence are an eternal soul, which is one with God not in the sense of radical non-duality, but in the sense of think about it as part and whole. Ramakrishna used to say, he used to quote Hanuman and say that I've come to the final realization that I am the master, not I'm the master, I'm a servant and God is the master. I am a part, God is a whole. And I am one with, I'm also absolutely identical with God as Nirguna Brahma. And so the part of that Hanuman quotation that I think is most effective in reconciling bhakti with jnana in the context of Vedantic mindfulness would be that second bhava, that second attitude, which is, I as an eternal soul am a part of the divine whole, which is, and then name your Ishta Devata. Is it Sri Ramakrishna or Shiva or Christ, whoever that might be. Yeah. Thank you so much. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.